On a cold March morning in 1985, a jogger following a wooded trail just outside the Ohio University campus noticed something odd in the brush. It first looked like discarded clothing, a jacket caught on a fallen branch. But as he stepped closer, the colors revealed the outline of a young woman's body partially hidden beneath leaves and winter debris. Her shoes were missing, one sock twisted as if pulled in a struggle, and her backpack lay 5 feet away, unzipped and emptied. The caller's voice on the 911 recording sounds stunned, almost breathless. "I think there's a girl here. She's not moving." Officers from the local police department arrived within minutes, and the area was immediately taped off. The victim was identified as a 19-year-old university student who had been reported missing the night before by her roommate. She had not returned from an evening study session. The coroner at the scene noted bruising on the wrists, signs of blunt force trauma around the temple, and a pattern of injuries consistent with what investigators would later classify as sexual assault. A broken wristwatch was frozen at 9:42 p.m., but detectives couldn't be certain if it reflected the moment of impact or a random malfunction. The Ohio campus community reacted with fear. The local news broadcast live from the scene that afternoon, showing investigators combing through brush with poles and tweezers. A homicide detective walked viewers through the basics. A cold case was not yet a possibility. This was fresh. Leads felt urgent. They were looking for anyone who had seen the victim on campus that night, anyone who could explain why murder had appeared without warning beside a quiet university trail. Within weeks, there were composite sketches, a list of potential suspects, countless interviews, and a press conference where the police chief promised action. But despite everything, the killer went unidentified. Decades passed, the case turned cold, and the original evidence boxes gathered dust in a secure archive. Then, nearly 40 years later, a forensic genealogy match revealed a name no one expected, leading to an arrest warrant, a grand jury indictment, and the closing of a chapter the victim's family never allowed to fade. This is the story of a cold case that survived decades, the science that revived it, and the community that finally learned the truth. She left the library a little after 9 p.m., according to a surviving timestamp on a sign-in sheet. One student, studying for a biology midterm at a nearby desk, remembered the victim packing her books in a slow, methodical way, looping her hair into a ponytail as she stood. She looked tired, but that was common during exam week. Some accounts say she paused at the library entrance, hesitated, then stepped out into the cold air. Others mentioned she exchanged a brief joke with a passing friend, something about getting coffee the next morning. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing suggested the last hour of her life had begun. Campus security logs show the sidewalks were busy that night. Students walked between residence halls and late-night diners. The victim's intended path should have taken her along a main road for nearly a mile, well-lit and populated. But the shortcut through a wooded trail, just a bend inward from the sidewalk, was faster by almost 10 minutes. In interviews conducted days later, one friend told detectives, "She always took the trail, even when we told her not to." It wasn't a dangerous place by reputation. The trail cut between tall trees and a creek, frequently used by joggers and dog walkers. At night, it was quiet, but not abandoned. The medical estimate suggested she never made it past the midpoint. The blow to the head, paired with signs of restraint, indicated the assault was sudden and forceful. There was no defensive wound on her hands, which led investigators to theorize she was struck from behind or overpowered in seconds. Her backpack strap was torn, one strap completely separated as if ripped. Detectives later noted that the seam failure pattern suggested a sharp pull during the attack. A coroner's field report described faint gravel impressions on her ankle, implying the body may have been dragged a short distance off the trail. Witness interviews were immediate and intensive. Police detectives canvassed the library, dormitories, and the 2 local diners that stayed open past midnight. The roommate who reported her missing was interviewed twice. In the official case file, the detectives typed notes described the roommate as cooperative, distraught, and consistent. She provided access to the victim's notebooks, class schedule, and personal calendar, which documented nothing suspicious. No recent conflicts, no threatening encounters. There were no journal entries hinting at a stalker. There was a brief mention of a group study meeting planned for the weekend, a reminder to call home on Sunday, and a list of vocabulary terms for the next exam. Physical evidence at the scene was collected using what, at the time, were considered standard but limited methods. Fibers from the victim's jacket, hair samples, and soil beneath her fingernails were sealed in paper envelopes and plastic containers. The technician in charge initialed each item, preserving chain of custody. A small amount of biological evidence was also collected, though its viability was uncertain. DNA testing existed, but its forensic utility was still emerging, not widely available in most state labs. The sample was marked "Hold for future analysis." No one could know that label would matter decades later. A shoe impression was found near the trail, described in the report as a partial tread with a distinct diamond-shaped pattern. A cast was taken, though it was incomplete. Officers noted similar patterns on common hiking boots, making the lead broad and difficult. The backpack revealed fingerprints, but they were smudged, incomplete, or belonging to the victim herself. Detectives attempted to reconstruct the timeline minute by minute, aligning the library departure with the estimated time of death inferred from the body temperature, the broken watch, and rigor onset. They placed the likely attack time between 9:35 and 9:50 p.m. Detectives developed several persons of interest within days. A local resident with prior assault allegations was questioned but released due to lack of evidence. 2 male students seen near the trail were interviewed, both providing alibis supported by dorm sign-in logs and eyewitness corroboration. A composite sketch was produced based on a reported sighting from a jogger who claimed to have seen a man standing near the bend. But the description was vague: mid-20s, dark jacket, average height. The press circulated the sketch anyway, hoping someone would recognize a familiar face. Campus life shifted immediately. Newspaper headlines used words like killer, predator, and manhunt. Students formed walking groups. Safety escorts doubled their shifts. The university organized emergency town halls where parents asked pointed questions about campus security. The police chief stood at a podium under bright lights, reporters shouting inquiries. In one televised statement, he promised, "We will not rest until the person responsible is identified and apprehended." Pressure created momentum, but not results. The homicide unit worked relentlessly through spring, interviews numbered in the hundreds. Detective James Holloway, then in his early 30s, led the evidence review. In later oral history transcripts, he described the period as a blur of door-knocking and false hope. Every new lead ended with elimination. Holloway believed the offender was not a stranger passing through. His notes suggest he suspected someone with knowledge of the trail and campus patterns. But without DNA comparisons and with no reliable fingerprint match, the case lacked the forensic anchor investigators needed. By June, weeks after the murder, the pace slowed. Media coverage moved on. National news attention faded. The university held a memorial service attended by hundreds of students, professors, and community members. Photographs from the event show candle flames trembling in the wind. Speakers told stories about the victim's kindness, her focus on medicine as a career path, her belief in public health. Her parents stood silent in the front row. They requested privacy and then quietly left town, returning home to deal with grief outside the glare of cameras. The case file thickened with reports, but nothing pointed conclusively to an offender. By late summer 1985, the investigation entered what the department called extended active status. The term meant the case was open but stagnant, without fresh leads. Holloway boxed the physical evidence, logged it into long-term storage, and typed his last supplemental report for the year. In that document, a single line stood out, written more as a hopeful note than a conclusion. Items preserved for future testing when technology advances. No one in the room that day imagined that the future would take nearly 4 decades. The cold case began quietly, like dust settling after a storm. And yet, without anyone realizing it, the story was only at its midpoint, waiting for science to become strong enough to speak for the victim. For the first 5 years, the case remained on an active shelf in the homicide unit, file folders stacked tightly in a metal drawer, labeled with the victim's name and the year of the offense. Detectives rotated assignments, but a few veterans returned repeatedly to study old photographs, reread typed interviews, and re-examine the physical evidence sheets. Nothing new surfaced. The work became an exercise in pattern recognition, hoping that a forgotten detail, overlooked sentence, or offhand remark could spark a realization. By 1990, cultural memory of the case shifted from a terrifying campus tragedy to a story elderly residents recalled when warning their grandchildren to avoid dark trails. Students enrolled, graduated, and moved away, unaware that a killer had once walked the same paths. Administrative change also reshaped the investigation. The original police chief retired, replaced by a younger leader trained in new policing strategies and influenced by national conference trends. He supported cold case work, but also prioritized rising crime rates in certain neighborhoods. The 1985 murder receded into a different category, unsolved but not urgent. When the department underwent a digital record transition in the early 1990s, the physical files were audited and scanned. Some items, photographs for example, were converted to microfilm. The technician performing the conversion noted fading ink on some handwritten witness statements. The passage of time was not only emotional, it was physical. Paper decays, memory fades, potential jurors die. In 1994, a new forensic term entered law enforcement vocabulary nationwide: CODIS, Combined DNA Index System. Laboratories began creating searchable genetic profiles from known offenders. But the technology required sufficient, intact biological samples, and in 1985, the sample collected from the victim was minimal and stored using methods that might have degraded over time. Still, the possibility of future testing electrified some investigators. Holloway, now a senior detective, requested the evidence be re-evaluated. The lab returned a cautious response. DNA extraction was possible, but the result might not be probative, meaning it may not produce a usable profile. The sample was too small, the science too young. The lead went cold before it began. Meanwhile, the victim's family did not rest. Each year, on the anniversary of her death, they mailed letters to the police department, addressed to the chief or to Holloway directly. The letters were polite, filled with gratitude for past work, but persistent. One line, copied into the case file by Holloway's assistant, read, "We understand time passes, but time should not erase accountability." The family held memorial services back home, attended by relatives who spoke of her as if she were still a student returning in the fall. Her mother kept her room preserved, bedding washed but never replaced, textbooks stacked exactly as they were found after the funeral. In interviews years later, her father would admit, "I kept imagining what she would look like at 25, 30, 40. The picture kept updating in my head, but the real girl never did." University culture transformed over the decades. By the early 2000s, new construction altered the trail where the body had been found. Parts were paved, lighting installed, a security camera mounted near an intersection. First-year students read safety guidelines in orientation packets without knowing the specific case that had shaped them. Campus rumor filled the gap where official history ceased. Stories about the girl in the woods, about a shadowy figure who disappeared without trace, about a killer who might still live nearby. Factual details dissolved into local myth. The victim's name was sometimes replaced with fictional ones, the circumstances exaggerated. Claims of multiple victims, of coded journal entries, of a police cover-up. The real case, meanwhile, remained in silence, waiting in storage. In 2005, the department reorganized again, forming a specialized unit dedicated to cold cases older than 15 years. The intent was both symbolic and practical. Give forgotten victims a path to justice. Holloway, now nearing retirement, volunteered to consult. He sat with younger detectives, sharing recollections of the 1985 crime scene. His memory was vivid. He could describe the position of the body, the cast of the partial shoe print, the color of the backpack, the sound of reporters asking if the trail would be closed. The physical evidence box was unsealed in the lab, and each item was cataloged against the original chain of custody logs. The sample marked "Hold for future analysis" was still present, still intact. A lab specialist scraped tiny remnants into a test tube, preparing the earliest version of polymerase chain reaction amplification. After weeks, the lab returned results. Partial markers, incomplete profile. Enough to confirm the presence of an unknown male contributor. Not enough to enter into CODIS with confidence. The partial profile, however, changed the case status. There was now genetic information, fragmentary, imperfect, but real. Detectives began reviewing all male subjects interviewed in 1985. 2 had died, 1 moved out of state. One individual, questioned briefly in 1985 after being described as near the trail, was recontacted in 2006. He provided a voluntary sample which excluded him immediately. Another man, then a student and described as a loner, was located in another city. He too was cooperative and eliminated. The process was slow, tedious, and yielded nothing. By 2009, the unit decided to conserve the remaining sample. The science wasn't ready yet. In the following decade, forensic science changed more rapidly than any detective could have predicted. The emergence of private sector DNA analysis, the rise of genealogical databases, and breakthroughs in single nucleotide polymorphism testing opened new investigatory pathways. Cases across the United States, once unsolvable by traditional methods, began to fall. The names of long-dead offenders surfaced through family tree reconstruction. The 1970s and 1980s, decades full of crimes committed before DNA profiling existed, now provided a tragic reservoir of cold cases ready for re-examination. The Ohio Department watched closely. In 2018, a high-profile case in another state demonstrated the power of forensic genealogy. Distant relatives led to the identification of a serial offender. News of that investigation circulated in law enforcement conferences, training bulletins, and email chains. A lieutenant in the cold case unit printed the summary, highlighting passages describing how a third cousin match opened an entire ancestral network. In the margin, the lieutenant wrote, "Is this applicable to 1985 case?" But application was not immediate. Forensic genealogy required not only a sample, but legal frameworks, funding, and coordination with labs equipped for deep SNP sequencing. Grant money became the limiting factor. In 2020, the cold case unit applied for a state research grant focused on violent crimes committed before widespread DNA testing. The proposal highlighted the 1985 homicide as a prime candidate due to preserved biological evidence. The grant was approved in early 2022. For the first time in decades, new energy entered the case. The evidence box was transported to a private lab specializing in forensic genealogy. The chain of custody form reads like a timeline of American forensic history. Signatures from 1985 officers using ink pens. Later entries written on digital printouts. The sample was handled with extreme caution. A lab director instructed staff to treat every microgram as if it were irreplaceable, because it was. The initial extraction produced enough high-density data to create a SNP profile suitable for comparison to genealogy databases. From there, algorithm-assisted search aligned markers with individuals who shared genetic ancestry. The first matches were distant, third and fourth cousins, mostly unrelated to the state where the murder occurred. The lab analyst built a family tree outward and backward, identifying branches across multiple generations. Lines pointed toward a rural Ohio lineage scattered over decades by migration. Investigators familiar with genealogy described the work as reverse engineering a family from the edges inward. Every name in the tree was a potential key, every connection a potential link to the suspect. Detectives in the cold case unit reviewed the tree. One surname appeared repeatedly, attached to multiple distant cousins spread across the Midwest. Within that name cluster, several male individuals born in the 1950s and early 1960s emerged as possible candidates based on age and geographical plausibility. One name stood out: a man who had lived within 40 miles of the university during the late 1980s, whose presence in the area had gone unnoticed during the original investigation. He had no prior convictions, no obvious motive. He was invisible to the initial suspect pool because early investigators focused heavily on university-affiliated individuals. Now, decades later, a pattern emerged. The suspect had worked seasonal jobs near the campus area in the 1980s. Pay records showed inconsistent employment dates overlapping with the year of the homicide. His background included outdoor labor, explaining potential familiarity with wooded areas. More importantly, his family tree positioned him directly at the center of the genealogical cluster identified by the lab. Investigators developed a strategy: perform covert DNA collection. Under guidance from the county prosecutor, surveillance teams observed the suspect's routine. They watched a trash pickup day on a quiet street. He discarded a takeout container and a soda bottle. Officers collected them after the bin reached the curb, ensuring the action fell within legal precedent regarding abandoned property. The items were sealed, labeled, and sent to the state lab. Weeks passed. The result arrived in a succinct, clinical form: DNA profile consistent with the unidentified biological material collected in 1985. Statistical probability exceeds baseline threshold. In other words, the DNA matched. The unknown male contributor was no longer unknown. With the match, the cold case unit prepared a detailed affidavit outlining decades of investigative work, the scientific breakthrough, and the genealogical tracing process. The county prosecutor requested a grand jury. 12 citizens heard testimony from lab experts, detectives, and the investigator who supervised the DNA extraction. A senior forensic genealogist explained, in plain language, how distant relatives led to the suspect. The jurors, some older than the victim would have been, listened carefully. After deliberation, the panel returned a true bill. The judge issued an arrest warrant. On paper, the case had finally broken. In reality, the moment carried weight built over 40 years, the accumulated grief of a family, the frustration of countless detectives, and the silent presence of evidence waiting for science to catch up. The cold case was no longer a story told in past tense. It moved into the present. The suspect, now elderly and living quietly, had no idea that decades of distance no longer protected him. The community that once feared the unknown now stood on the threshold of knowing everything. The arrest would happen in early winter under pale morning light. But before that moment, the case existed in a fragile state, between history and justice, between unanswered questions and the beginning of accountability. The journey from trail to trial had taken almost half a lifetime, and it was only now that the family's letters, preserved year after year in the case file, found their answer. The lab did not celebrate when the match came through. Forensic scientists are trained to see statistics, not stories. The report was delivered to investigators in the same tone used for any evidentiary finding: measured, cautious, filled with qualifiers. But in the cold case unit, the reaction was different. Detectives stared at the summary page the way a person looks at an old photograph, recognizing both the past and the present in a single image. A case that had lived in rumor, fear, and unanswered questions now had a name. The suspect's identity, once buried in layers of time, surfaced through a method unknown in 1985: forensic genealogy. Forensic genealogy begins where traditional DNA ends. Instead of searching for a direct match in a criminal database, investigators look for genetic similarities in civilian genealogical platforms, places where people upload their DNA to learn about ethnicity, ancestry, and distant relatives. The science uses SNP testing, single nucleotide polymorphisms, hundreds of thousands of genetic markers scattered across the genome. These tiny variations, when compared against other samples, reveal familial links. A match with a third cousin might seem irrelevant, but to genealogists, it is a signpost pointing toward a larger family network. The lab's report summarized the process. A DNA sample taken from biological material collected in 1985 was analyzed using SNP sequencing. The resulting genetic profile was uploaded to a restricted access database created specifically for law enforcement. Within days, the system identified several distant relatives, each sharing small segments of DNA with the unknown contributor. None of these individuals lived in Ohio. None had any knowledge of the crime. But their genetic pattern created a puzzle that analysts could solve. Genealogy software built a family tree by combining census records, marriage certificates, birth announcements, obituaries, public documents, and digital archives. The tree expanded, branched backward into the 19th century, then expanded forward again into the present. Dozens of names appeared. At first, it seemed like a web without a center, but a trend emerged. Multiple descendants tied to one ancestral couple living in Ohio generations ago. Every person on the list lived within the genetic boundary suggested by the shared markers. The initial list included more than 20 male individuals. Analysts filtered by age, removing those too young to be present in 1985 and those too old to plausibly be the offender. Then they considered geography. Some lived far out of state during the relevant period. Others had moved through Ohio briefly, but without evidence placing them near the university. Each name was analyzed with the same methodical detachment used in 1985 interviews, but now augmented with digital data. Only one name fit all variables. A man born in the late 1950s, raised in Ohio, employed in seasonal jobs near the university in 1985, and without any known criminal record. No arrest history meant no DNA in CODIS, which is why the profile never matched earlier searches. His absence from the original suspect pool was not the result of genius or planning, it was statistical anonymity. He simply never crossed the investigative threshold in 1985. He lived near the crime, but not on campus. He socialized near the area, but not with students. He was close enough to be present, far enough to be invisible. Detectives spent several weeks building a historical profile. Employment records showed irregular schedules, short-term assignments for local contractors, including outdoor maintenance jobs. One entry specifically noted a subcontractor position clearing brush near recreational trails. The document did not mention the university, but the proximity was clear. A 1985 payroll sheet placed him working within 2 miles of the homicide location during the exact month of the crime. A detective remarked quietly during a briefing, "He was right there the whole time." But proximity alone could not secure an arrest. The cold case unit needed contemporary confirmation, a modern DNA sample collected legally and without violating constitutional protections. Surreptitious collection is a method used when a suspect is unaware of the investigation. Legally, discarded items placed for trash collection are considered abandoned property. Courts have repeatedly held that once disposed, the individual forfeits privacy expectation. But procedure matters. Officers waited until the bin was placed at the curb, not on private property, and only then collected items with potential saliva or skin cells. The first attempt failed. Contamination risk was too high. The second attempt, involving a takeout cup lid with a visible saliva straw seal, provided a cleaner sample. The lab compared the modern DNA with the degraded material from 1985. The conclusion was definitive. The samples came from the same individual. The statistical probability exceeded forensic thresholds, with the lab calculating likelihood ratios far stronger than anything law enforcement had in the 1990s or early 2000s. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was genetic identity. With scientific certainty established, investigators began building a prosecutable narrative, a legal arc explaining how the case traveled from 1985 to modern technology. This required more than a DNA match. Prosecutors needed to demonstrate chain of custody integrity across 4 decades, justify genealogical methodology to a jury, and anticipate defense arguments regarding sample degradation. Every paper record was scanned, indexed, and reviewed. Signatures from officers long retired, some deceased, took on new relevance. A slip of paper initialed JH became crucial. It verified that the original biological evidence had been sealed properly. Next came the decision to present the case to a grand jury. In Ohio, a grand jury determines whether sufficient probable cause exists to proceed with criminal charges. The process is secret. Jurors hear testimony, examine evidence summaries, and question subject matter experts. It is not a trial, it is a gate. If the panel issues a true bill, prosecutors can move forward with an arrest. The courtroom scene was quiet. The cold case detective, younger than the crime itself, testified first, explaining the history of the investigation. He spoke with deliberate detail, describing how the case went cold not due to negligence, but due to forensic limits. The jury listened, some leaning forward. Few had been alive in 1985. For them, the murder was a historical event resurfacing in the present. Next came the forensic genealogist, a specialist trained to explain complex biology in ordinary language. She described SNP markers as small flags inside our DNA, signposts that reveal connections across families. She explained how distant cousins, unrelated to the crime, inadvertently helped identify the suspect through shared ancestry. The jurors asked questions. How accurate is it? Could two people share this much DNA by coincidence? The answer was direct. The statistical probability of a coincidence was less than 1 in billions. One juror asked the question that many in the room were thinking. Why now? Why did it take 40 years? The genealogist paused. Then she answered, because the science didn't exist. We needed time, not just to develop technology, but to reach a point where society accepted using it for justice. Her answer landed like a quiet acknowledgement of generations waiting for closure. When the lab director testified, she brought visual aids, diagrams of DNA sequences, color-coded charts showing allele matches between samples, and a simplified version of the family tree. The tree was stripped of irrelevant names. Only the lineage leading to the suspect remained. It was a map of probability and identity converging on a single individual. Detectives also presented contextual evidence: the suspect's proximity in 1985, the employment records, and the lack of alternative explanations. No other individuals from the family cluster were within 1,000 miles of the crime scene during the relevant period. No other male relatives of compatible age could be placed in Ohio that year. In the logic of forensic genealogy, this narrowed the circle to a point. After deliberation, the grand jury issued its decision: a true bill for aggravated murder and sexual assault. The judge signed an arrest warrant. The document was brief, stating only the legal basis and the charges, but the signature at the bottom marked the transition from theory to action. The cold case unit prepared for the arrest with a seriousness typically reserved for violent, current offenders. Though the suspect was elderly, safety protocols remained unchanged. Officers reviewed floor plans of the suspect's home, assessed risk variables, and coordinated with the local sheriff's office. Some detectives felt tension, the emotional weight of an investigation older than their careers. Others felt the gravity of history, the sense that they were carrying the final chapter of a story their predecessors could not finish. In planning meetings, one topic surfaced repeatedly: community reaction. The suspect lived in a quiet neighborhood. Neighbors saw him as polite, helpful, perhaps isolated, but never dangerous. Arresting a man of advanced age for a 40-year-old crime would send shockwaves through the area. News cameras would arrive. Reporters would revisit 1985 headlines. The victim's family would likely travel to Ohio. Detectives prepared statements emphasizing forensic methodology, not sensationalism. The night before the arrest, the lead detective revisited the evidence file. It included photographs from the original scene, images now decades old but still striking in their detail. The captions, typed on a mechanical typewriter, described physical objects that had outlived their owner: a torn backpack strap, a broken watch, soil impressions on a sock. The detective flipped through handwritten interview notes transferred from brittle paper to digital printouts. A final page displayed the line written by Holloway in 1985, "Items preserved for future testing when technology advances." 40 years later, the technology had arrived. The arrest occurred early on a winter morning, just after sunrise. A light dusting of frost covered lawns and cars. Officers approached quietly, wearing jackets marked with the emblem of the cold case unit. When the door opened, the suspect appeared confused. His age was visible in his posture, his slowed movement. Investigators read the warrant. He listened, silent. The legal language, aggravated murder, sexual assault, 1985, hung in the air like an echo from another era. As he was escorted to the vehicle, neighbors emerged from their doors, bewildered. A few filmed the scene. One asked an officer, "What's happening?" The answer was simple: cold case arrest. The phrase carried weight, even without context. Within hours, local news published headlines referencing the 1985 university murder. The story spread rapidly. Social media filled with comments from former students, older residents, and strangers fascinated by the power of forensic DNA. The victim's name reappeared in public memory, this time tied to justice, not mystery. In the police station, the suspect sat in an interview room. On the table lay a printed copy of the DNA report, a photograph of the trail in 1985, and a list of charges authorized by the grand jury. The interrogation would follow protocol: recorded video, 2 detectives present, a clear explanation of rights. The suspect would speak, deny, hesitate, or remain silent. But the science did not hesitate. DNA had waited 40 years to speak first. Outside the station, reporters gathered. The cold case detective gave a brief statement, emphasizing that the case was solved through forensic genealogy, decades of preserved evidence, and the persistence of a family that never stopped asking. Behind him, cameras captured an image powerful enough to travel through every screen. The idea that time does not protect the guilty, not anymore. The community reacted with a mix of shock and vindication. For older residents, it was a wound reopened and finally addressed. For younger generations, it was a lesson in the endurance of justice. The university released a statement honoring the victim, acknowledging the case's influence on campus safety reforms. A memorial vigil, once a fading ritual, reignited with new purpose. The family, upon hearing the news, prepared to travel back to Ohio. After decades of letters, prayers, and unanswered calls, the phrase "cold case" no longer meant forgotten. It meant resolved. The journey that began on a trail in 1985 now moved into a courtroom, where science, history, and memory would converge. The final chapters of the case would unfold publicly. But beneath the headlines and court proceedings, one fact stood alone. A fragment of DNA, preserved in an envelope for 40 years, had illuminated a path no one could see in 1985. The victim's voice, silenced on a winter night, found its way back through science. Not loud, but undeniable. The cold case was no longer a question. It was an answer. Before we continue this case, do me a favor, hit that like button. It tells YouTube this story matters and helps us bring more forgotten cases back into the light. Subscribe if you want to keep seeing cases like this, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. The arrest warrant was signed at 5:42 a.m., stamped with the seal of the county's clerk of courts, and delivered electronically to the sheriff's office before dawn. A grand jury had reviewed the cold case evidence package the previous week, close to 4 hours of testimony, including forensic genealogists, lab technicians, and the lead investigator from the cold case unit, and voted to indict an 82-year-old man named Gerald "Jerry" Whitmore, a lifelong resident of Ohio with no prior criminal record. His name had never appeared in the original 1985 case file. There were no interviews, no witness mentions, no arrest reports tied to him. His presence in the modern case was the result of a family tree built backward from distant cousins, a triangulation of DNA through public databases, and a confirmation collected from a discarded coffee cup. At 6:13 a.m., two unmarked vehicles rolled slowly along a quiet residential street framed with leafless trees and half-melted snow. A tactical detail followed, light bars dark, windows tinted. The suspect's house was a one-story ranch structure with aluminum siding, a sagging porch railing, and a wreath still hanging from the previous holidays. The team leader signaled with two fingers, and officers moved into position. The neighbors would later describe hearing heavy knocking and shouting commands, "Sheriff's office, search warrant," echoing through the morning air. Whitmore opened the door only after the knob was forced, standing in the doorway wearing a flannel shirt and holding his glasses in one hand. He looked stunned but not confused. Officers entered, secured him, and placed handcuffs behind his back, using a double lock to prevent friction injuries on an elderly subject. A crime lab photographer documented the arrest for chain of custody continuity and visual record. The warrant included the seizure of any personal items related to the 1980s period: journals, photographs, vehicle maintenance logs, and clothing, though the likelihood of relevant physical evidence surviving 4 decades was low. The suspect was transported to the county detention facility under medical supervision. The booking procedure was standard: fingerprints, though symbolic given the DNA match, an intake photo, a basic medical questionnaire, and the reading of charges. Whitmore asked only one question: "What exactly do you think I did?" The deputy responded by stating the statutory charges: aggravated murder under Ohio Revised Code Section 2903.01 and rape under Section 2907.02 as defined in the 1985 statute language applicable at the time of the crime. Because the crime predated certain sentencing reforms, prosecutors would later navigate complex legal intersections between historical statutes and modern sentencing guidelines. The interrogation room chosen for the interview was small and neutral, with a table bolted to the concrete floor. 2 chairs faced each other, and a digital recorder with redundant storage captured every second. The interview team consisted of the lead cold case detective and a prosecutor assigned to the case. Before the interview began, the suspect's attorney, appointed temporarily pending counsel confirmation, sat beside Whitmore. The Miranda waiver was read, and the attorney declined any further responses until he had reviewed the evidence disclosures. Still, Whitmore spoke voluntarily. He denied knowing the victim. He denied being anywhere near the university campus in 1985. He claimed he had worked full-time at a local manufacturing plant during that year, operating heavy machinery. When asked about his movements during the weekend the victim disappeared, he shrugged and said he couldn't remember where he was 40 years ago on a random weekend. His voice was calm, and he sometimes smiled when answering the questions, as if trying to appear cooperative without revealing emotion. The detective showed him a printed photograph of the victim, taken from her student ID card. He stared at it expressionless. The attorney leaned forward and stated that the photograph had no evidentiary meaning unless the prosecution had proof of physical connection. The detective responded by describing, in step-by-step procedural language, the DNA evidence pathway. Original biological sample preserved with a complete chain of custody log. Extraction using modern SNP-based sequencing. Genotype upload to a restricted forensic genealogy database. Identification of multiple distant relatives. Construction of a family tree using birth records, census information, military draft cards, and obituary data. And the final match confirmed through the suspect's discarded DNA. It was a concise map of 40 years of investigative distance closed by 21st century technology. Whitmore shook his head slowly. "People shed DNA everywhere," he said. "How can you be sure someone didn't mess with it over the years?" The detective answered, "Because the sample was sealed in 1985 by detectives who understood evidence preservation. It wasn't touched, opened, or exposed until the laboratory extraction last year." The attorney demanded to see the custody logs and testing protocols, which would be provided in discovery. In another part of the building, the prosecutor was preparing a public statement. Because of the age of the case and the community's memory of the homicide, media engagement had to be carefully controlled. There would be no speculation about motive, no release of specific biological evidence details beyond what was already included in the indictment, and no public theory regarding how the victim encountered the suspect. The office would emphasize the role of forensic genealogy and the grand jury's independent review. By noon, news of the arrest spread through the county with staggering speed. Local reporters appeared outside the courthouse, broadcasting live segments against a backdrop of swirling snow. On social media, former university students, now middle-aged parents, posted memories of the fear that gripped the campus in 1985, rumors that circulated in dorm hallways, and the annual vigils that quietly faded over the years. The shock wasn't that someone had finally been arrested, it was who that someone was. Whitmore had been known in the community for decades as a quiet, polite man who attended church services, volunteered during local elections, and lived alone after his wife's passing. His neighbors described him as harmless, soft-spoken, and someone you wouldn't think twice about. The image of an elderly man being led away in handcuffs contrasted violently with the crime described in the indictment. A 19-year-old university student attacked, assaulted, and left in a wooded lot near the edge of campus. The detectives had anticipated this reaction. Cold case arrests rarely involve the type of suspect profiles that the public imagines from contemporary crime stories. The lead investigator met with the victim's family privately before the press conference. The family members, now older than their daughter had ever been, sat in a quiet conference room with framed photographs of previous sheriffs on the wall. They listened as the detective explained the evidence and the process behind the arrest. The victim's mother, now in her 80s, remained silent for most of the conversation. But her son, the victim's younger brother, asked specific questions about the reliability of the genealogical testing. He had read extensively about forensic genealogy after seeing similar cold cases solved across the country. The detective confirmed that the probability of error was infinitesimally small, supported by both genealogical inference and direct DNA match. The mother eventually asked one question: "Are you sure this is the person who hurt my daughter?" The detective answered with the formality of a sworn officer and the humanity of someone who had worked the case for years. She nodded, holding a small photograph of her daughter that she had kept folded inside her coat. The press conference began at 3 p.m. sharp. A podium bearing the sheriff's office emblem stood in front of a row of flags. Reporters gathered with cameras, microphones, and handheld recorders. The sheriff spoke first, summarizing the timeline of the original investigation, emphasizing the persistence of the detective who reopened the case, and acknowledging the agony of 4 decades of unanswered questions. Then the prosecutor stepped forward, reading the formal charges and noting that a grand jury had issued the indictment. Questions immediately focused on the DNA evidence. "How can you charge someone based solely on genealogical inference?" one reporter asked. The prosecutor clarified that the genealogical research was only a tool for identification. The charges were based on a direct DNA match between biological material recovered from the victim and the suspect's discarded sample, processed under accredited laboratory protocols. Another reporter asked about motive. The prosecutor declined to speculate. In cases this old, motive often disappears into the past, fragmented by lost context and unrecorded interactions. Campus interviews with residents showed a community struggling to reconcile the past with the present. Some expressed relief. Others doubted whether an elderly man could be tried fairly for a crime committed in a different era. A few questioned whether the science was too complex for the average juror to understand, worrying that the trial might hinge on expert testimony that could be manipulated or misunderstood. The prosecutor's office had anticipated such concerns. They planned to introduce expert witnesses capable of explaining forensic genealogy in plain language. Whitmore's initial court appearance took place 2 days after the arrest. He was escorted into the courtroom wearing a county-issued jumpsuit, his hands unshackled but his ankles secured. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity, Family members, former classmates of the victim who had returned to town for the hearing, reporters, and curious residents who remembered the campus fear from decades earlier. The judge read the charges and asked the defendant for his plea. On advice of counsel, Whitmore spoke quietly into the microphone, "Not guilty." The prosecutor requested that he be held without bond, citing the severity of the charges and the need to preserve the integrity of the investigation. Defense counsel argued that Whitmore was 82 years old, had no prior criminal record, was not a flight risk, and deserved to be released pending trial. The judge reviewed the pre-hearing report, noted the seriousness of the offense, and denied bond. The suspect was remanded into custody. Behind the procedural tone of the court record, there was a deeper current moving beneath the legal surface. Cold cases exist in two timelines: the past, where evidence is collected, people speak, and decisions are made under the pressure of immediate time, and the future, where that evidence is re-examined with new technologies, new legal frameworks, and new cultural expectations. The jury that would eventually hear the case would sit 40 years removed from the moment the crime occurred, weighing evidence from a world with no forensic genealogy against analyses from a world where such technology could rebuild family trees from microscopic fragments of biological material. After the hearing, the victim's family stepped outside through a side exit to avoid the crowd. They declined interviews, issuing only a short written statement through the sheriff's office. It read, "We have waited 40 years for this day. We are grateful to the detectives who never stopped believing that our daughter's story mattered. We ask for privacy as the legal process continues." Inside the sheriff's office, the cold case detectives gathered around a table scattered with documents, lab reports, sworn statements, and historical police memos. The arrest was not the end of their work. If anything, it signaled the start of a new phase. They would retrace the victim's final movements with modern forensic tools, examine interview transcripts with fresh eyes, map old witness statements against present-day data, and prepare for a courtroom environment where every decision from 1985 could be questioned by the defense. Cold cases are not solved by a match alone. They are solved through the accumulation of small certainties until the truth becomes undeniable. For nearly 40 years, the case had lived inside cardboard boxes labeled with faded marker ink, each one containing fragments of a life cut short, photographs, typewritten reports, maps with circles drawn in red ink, and sealed envelopes holding evidence collected during an era when the concept of DNA typing barely existed. Now, those fragments pointed toward a living man whose genetic identity had survived decades of silence, preserved in microscopic traces that refused to disappear. In the hallway of the courthouse that night, after the crowds had left and only the echoes remained, a detective paused beside a bulletin board containing photographs of solved cold cases. The board displayed names and dates under the heading "Closed Through Evidence." He looked at the empty space reserved for the 1985 university case. The arrest was only the beginning of closure, but after 40 years of uncertainty, beginning was enough. The trial did not begin immediately. Months passed between the indictment and the first motions hearing, and during that time, the case transformed from a local cold case headline into a state-level legal test of forensic genealogy. The prosecution filed a comprehensive evidence disclosure packet, laboratory certifications, chain of custody logs reaching back to 1985, expert affidavits explaining single nucleotide polymorphism testing, genealogical tree-building procedures, and the step-by-step documentation of how the suspect's discarded DNA was collected during surveillance. The defense filed motions challenging the admissibility of genetic genealogy, arguing that public genealogy databases, even those restricted for law enforcement use, constituted an unreasonable search without a traditional warrant. The judge scheduled oral arguments for a full evidentiary hearing, knowing that whatever decision he rendered would likely be cited in other cold case prosecutions. In the months between filings, the community continued to absorb the shock. Photographs of the victim circulated across social platforms, her student ID portrait, candid shots from university clubs, a yearbook image with a handwritten message to a friend. People who had been students during that era, now ages 55 to 65, shared stories about how the murder shaped their first year away from home. The curfews imposed in dormitories, the buddy system created for walking at night, the theories that spread through late-night conversations in common rooms. The crime had not only stolen a life, it had altered the atmosphere of a campus and the memories of an entire generation of students. In the courthouse lobby, journalists set up portable lights waiting for updates after motion hearings. One reporter, now in her 30s, had been assigned to the story because her mother had been a student at the university in 1985. She interviewed retired professors who remembered the campus lockdown, the police presence during lectures, and the grief counselors who met with students. It wasn't just a case file, one said. It was something that lived in every hallway. We saw the world as less safe after that. Inside the courtroom, the legal battle over DNA evidence unfolded in technical language that sometimes felt remote from the emotional core of the case. Experts described how genealogical databases worked, distinguishing between law enforcement-only databases and public consumer systems. They explained permissions, privacy statements, and the differences between STR testing used in CODIS and SNP testing used for genealogical inference. Charts were displayed showing family trees, the number of relatives used to triangulate the suspect's identity, and the statistical probability that another individual could share the same genetic markers related to the crime scene sample. The defense cross-examined methodically, attempting to sow doubt. "Isn't it true," one attorney asked, "that determining someone's identity from distant relatives involves inference, not certainty?" The expert replied, "Inference is simply the process of narrowing to a likely individual. The match itself, the confirmation, comes from direct DNA testing of that individual sample. There is no inference in that stage." The judge ultimately denied the motion to suppress the DNA evidence. His written decision spanned 32 pages, citing precedent on abandoned DNA, the constitutional limits of privacy in discarded items, and the legitimacy of genealogical inference as an investigative tool rather than the evidentiary basis of the charge. The ruling stated clearly, "The evidence presented at trial will rely upon direct biological comparison. The genealogical research, while essential to identifying a suspect, is not in itself the evidence of guilt." With the decision issued, the trial date was set. Jury selection took place in a packed courtroom. Prospective jurors answered questions about their views on forensic science, privacy, aging suspects, and whether the passage of 40 years made it more difficult to render an impartial verdict. Many expressed concerns about remembering events from that long ago. How could anyone know what truly happened when so much time had passed? The prosecution reminded them that they were not expected to reconstruct 1985 from memory. Their task was to evaluate evidence preserved from that time and analyzed with modern tools. Opening statements set the tone. The prosecution emphasized the victim's story. A young woman walking home from a campus event, her final steps unrecorded except in forensic fragments. They described the preservation of the evidence envelope, sealed with tape nearly 4 decades prior, marked with signatures of detectives who believed the future might reveal answers that the present could not. They introduced the concept of time-resistant evidence, biological material that does not fade with memory, that remains silent but intact until science finds the language to interpret it. The defense focused on reasonable doubt. They argued that the original investigation was incomplete, that the chain of events leading to the suspect's identification involved a new technology unfamiliar to the average juror, and that the state could not prove any interaction between the suspect and the victim beyond the presence of DNA. They suggested, indirectly, that contamination or error could not be entirely ruled out after so much time. They did not present an alternative theory. Instead, they attempted to build doubt around the prosecution's certainty. As the trial progressed, the courtroom became an archive of 2 eras. Retired detectives testified about the original crime scene, reading from notes typed on yellowed paper. A former student who found the victim's bag near the wooded path testified with visible emotion. He explained how the discovery had stayed with him his entire life, a moment he never forgot even as details faded. A forensic pathologist presented the autopsy report, acknowledging that certain injury interpretations were limited by medical terminology of the mid-1980s compared to present standards. Then came the modern experts. A forensic scientist described SNP extraction as if guiding a jury through a microscopic landscape. A genealogist displayed a simplified family tree diagram marking the connections between distant relatives that led to one branch, one individual. A DNA analyst presented the statistical certainty of the match. "There is no ambiguity," she said. "The DNA from the crime scene and the DNA collected from the defendant are consistent to a degree that excludes all other individuals except an identical twin. The defendant has no identical twin." The defendant did not testify. He sat at the defense table, sometimes watching the monitors displaying DNA charts, sometimes looking at the floor. His posture remained steady, but his hands occasionally shook when documents were passed across the table. Only once did he react visibly, when the victim's mother entered the courtroom to testify about her daughter's last phone call, describing her voice and plans for the future. For a moment, the defendant looked toward her with an unreadable expression, neither remorse nor defiance, but something closer to confusion or resignation. Closing arguments returned to the themes set months earlier. The prosecutor described the case as the convergence of past and present, of physical truth outlasting human memory. "The crime was committed in 1985, he said, but the evidence speaks today. The passage of time does not change the nature of the act, only the tools we use to reveal it." The defense argued that science could appear precise while hiding assumptions, that the state's narrative was compelling but incomplete, and that a conviction must be based on certainty beyond reasonable doubt, not the emotion of a long-awaited resolution. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. The first 9 hours passed with no message to the court. On the 10th hour, jurors requested a readback of expert testimony regarding the probability of a DNA match. The court complied. At the 11-hour mark, the bailiff notified the judge that a verdict had been reached. The courtroom filled within minutes. The defendant stood, hands clasped in front of him. The victim's family sat in the front row. The verdict was read calmly, without drama. Guilty of aggravated murder. Guilty of rape. The courtroom remained silent for a moment, absorbing the words. The defendant closed his eyes. The victim's mother held her son's hand tightly. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of residents and media gathered beneath a winter sky. Some applauded, others cried quietly. A case that had lived in shadows for decades had reached a public conclusion. Sentencing occurred 3 weeks later. The judge reviewed statements from both sides. The prosecutor read a letter written by the victim's brother, describing the impact of losing a sibling before adulthood, the years of uncertainty, and the sense of suspended grief. The defense requested consideration for the defendant's age and health, arguing that a life sentence was unnecessary. The judge rejected the request. He imposed a sentence of life imprisonment, noting that the severity of the crime required the maximum penalty allowed under the statute applicable at the time of the offense. The defendant was led from the courtroom, his steps slow but steady. The victim's family remained seated until the room emptied, surrounded by friends who had stood with them through years of waiting. Outside, reporters gathered for statements. The family spoke briefly. The victim's brother said, "Today is not about closure. Nothing closes what was taken. But truth matters, evidence matters, and my sister mattered." In the months following sentencing, the university held a memorial. Students and faculty gathered near the wooded area where the victim had been found, now preserved as part of a campus green space with a small plaque commemorating victims of violence. Candles lined the path. A professor spoke about the role of memory in justice, how communities carry stories silently until someone gives them voice again. The event ended with a moment of collective quiet. the kind of silence that acknowledges both loss and relief. The sheriff's office added a framed photograph of the victim to the closed-through evidence board. A new line of text appeared below, resolved by forensic genealogy and DNA match. For the detectives who had worked the case, especially those who had retired years earlier, the resolution represented not just the end of an investigation, but the fulfillment of a promise made in 1985 by a young officer writing notes in the cold wind of a crime scene. He had written on the back of a report, "Preserve everything. The future may tell us what we cannot see today." The case became a reference point across the state. Other jurisdictions began reviewing old homicide files with preserved biological material, creating cold case units dedicated to reopening decades-old investigations. Some cases would never find answers. Evidence had been lost or degraded or never collected. But others, just a few, would yield matches that connected past violence to present accountability. In a town where memories had faded into legend, the truth emerged from microscopic strands preserved in an envelope. The community learned that justice is not always swift, that the distance between crime and consequence can stretch across generations. But when evidence is preserved, when science advances, and when investigators refuse to close a case simply because time has passed, even a 40-year silence can be broken. The cold case was no longer cold, and the story of a young university student from 1985, once frozen in unanswered questions, now existed in the record of resolved crimes, proof that even after decades of darkness, evidence can still bring light. If cases like this matter to you, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss when we bring another case to light. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'll reply with a shocking crime fact from your location.